Friends, hello there. Welcome to another episode in the teaching series. Hey, I'm recording this on July 5th, which means we had some crazy festivities going on around here in Nashville yesterday as my whole neighborhood was lit up with fireworks. Like, I've never seen people so bananas about fireworks. I mean, we just sit in our cul-de-sac and not only are my neighbors firing off all these firecrackers and fireworks from our cul-de-sac, but so is everybody else in the neighborhood. And you don't even have to go anywhere. You can just sit outside your door and get the best fireworks display that you can get. So that was last night for me, but right before we started watching the fireworks, we had already had a meal as a neighborhood cul-de-sac, so we had the grills out, and we were having all kinds of fun, and so we went into our backyard and we brought forth a campfire so that people could come over and roast some s'mores and have a little bit of dessert before we went back into the cul-de-sac and just watched all of the festivities. And so it was last night where I was sitting around watching this campfire where a story was triggered in my mind. In fact, I can't sit around a campfire without this story coming to mind. And I think you'll understand it in just a few moments, but it comes from Exodus chapter 3. It's Moses. He spent the first 40 years in Pharaoh's household as Egyptian royalty, and now he's just spent the next 40 years of his life as a shepherd of sheep and goats in the middle of the stinking desert. And it is at this moment where this story occurs. Verse 1, chapter 3. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him with flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. So Moses is in the Sinai desert, and Mount Horeb is also known as Mount Sinai. There's lots of options for where Mount Sinai is. The two most prevalent are in the southern part of the Sinai, but this is what the landscape looks like around there. I took these pictures several years ago when I was hiking through the Sinai desert, and Moses is with his sheep and goats, and all of a sudden he sees a bush on fire. And what's interesting is that the text tells us what Moses thought. Now, this is very rare in the scriptures. When stories are told, certain details are given, but one kind of detail that's almost never given is what the characters are thinking. They just recount what the characters do. But in this case, Moses goes, all right, there's a strange sight. This bush is on fire and it's not burning up. And Moses says, so I'm going to go over and see this. This is what he is thinking. Now, when I've read this story historically in the past, I always thought, well, the miracle going on here is that the bush was on fire, that's what captured Moses' attention. That's actually not the case. It's that the bush is on fire, but it's not burning up. You see, bushes like this in the desert will at times burst into flames. This would not have been the first time Moses saw a bush on fire. And what happens is, and this is what my good friend Yehuda, who is a guide that I partner with in Israel, he's a desert specialist, and we've talked about this on several occasions, and he says, Brad, listen, in the desert, when you have several days of a very, very dry, hot wind that's going through, he said the bushes become electrostatic. And he says all it takes is an animal brushing up against it or a twig kind of flying through the desert and just tipping it and a small spark, and he says, and the whole thing will go up in flames. So the miracle going on here isn't so much that the bush is on fire, it's that it's not burning up. Now this makes us to go a step further. Like if you were to sit around a campfire with me like this video, how long would it take you and me to observe that these logs were on fire, but they weren't burning up? You see, it's not something that you figure out in 5 or 10 seconds. In this case, you would have to stare at these for several minutes before you came to this realization. And this is what seems to be the biggest miracle going on in this story. Yes, it's a miracle that, God is speaking to Moses from a bush. Yes, that is absolutely a miracle. But the other miracle here is that Moses has slowed down long enough to observe something that has caught his attention, and he's able to perceive that there is something going on, and he goes over to check it out. Now, the first person to tip me off to an understanding about this is a guy by the name of Rabbi Lawrence Kushner. And in his book, God Was in This Place and I Did Not Know, he writes this about this story in Exodus chapter 3. And this is in verse 25, and he says, "The burning bush was not a miracle. It was a test. God wanted to find out whether or not Moses could pay attention to something for more than a few minutes. When Moses did, God spoke. The trick is to pay attention to what is going on around you long enough to behold the miracle without falling asleep. There is another world right here within this one whenever we pay attention." Oh, so love that. I love the fact that Lawrence Kushner has highlighted this reality that for Moses, the miracle was he slowed down long enough. And in doing so, he had an encounter with the living God of the universe. And the conversation is equally as fascinating as just the whole way it begins. It says that when Moses saw that the bush was on fire, he went over, and it says, verse 4, "When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called him from within the bush, 'Moses, Moses.' And Moses said, 'Here I am. Do not come any closer.' God said, 'Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground.'" Now again, when I've traditionally looked at this story, I always thought that when God says, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground," it's because God has shown up and the place has now become holy. I actually don't believe that. I actually think what's going on here is that God has been there all along. And what has now become holy is the fact that Moses has woken up to the reality that God has been there. And when God says, "Take off your sandals," it's not that the place just became holy. It's that Moses has not just now been tipped off to the fact that he has been in a place that has been holy all along. And again, this is Kushner. He's informing me and many others on this. And this is what I love just a few pages later. This is what Kushner writes about how Judaism sees the world. He just says this on page 28. "Judaism sees only one world, which is material and spiritual at the same time. The material world is always potentially spiritual. For Judaism, all things, including and especially such apparently non-spiritual and grossly material things as garbage, sweat, dirt, and bushes, that these things are not impediments to, but dimensions of spirituality. To paraphrase the psalmist, the whole world is full of God." That's from Psalm 24:1. And then he concludes, "The business of religion is to keep that awesome truth ever before us." It's so easy for us to look at the world and go, well, that's sacred and that's secular. That's holy and that is unholy. That's where God is and that's where God is not. But the scriptures talk about that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, that God is everywhere. And what that tells us is that any place has the potential to burst forth with holiness because God's presence is already there. And I believe that what God was teaching Moses to do in this story is to recognize that in the daily, mundane, humdrum experience of life, and for Moses here, he's in the middle of a bland desert with a bunch of sheep and goats, is that God was helping Moses wake up to the reality that there is a divine in the daily, that there is sacred and holy encounters in just the daily life things, that oftentimes we look for God in the big things and we look for God in these really big moments, and yet there is a divine in the daily where anything in our day could turn out to be something more sacred and more holy than we ever could imagine if we can just slow down long enough and pay attention to things going on around us. Like Moses, we may have an encounter with God. Now, I was just thinking through this more and more, and I go, how come I don't have more of these moments? And I think that part of the answer to that just dawned on me is just a week ago, my family and I got back from vacation. And it was just after a really busy season. And I remember on one particular day going out with a walk with my 3-year-old Zyler. And we're just like walking down the road. And this is several days into vacation. I don't know about you, but it always takes me like a couple of days to settle into vacation. Like my mind is still running. I feel like I have to be doing things. Like it just feels wrong just to sit and slow down. And I remember just walking along with my boy Zyler. And it's like I'm hearing all these things in the woods and all of these things are flying over above. And I just feel like I'm so much more present. I'm so much more aware to the things that are going on around me. And it's because all of the other noise had been stripped away. I mean, we're walking along and I'm just thinking about how fast life can be. For me, I'm sure for you, where you just feel this sense of, man, things are just always moving at a really great clip. And for me, it was such a breath of fresh air just taking this walk. And we found out in the woods this like old rusted out car. And Zyler got a picture in front of it and he kind of looks like he's yelling there. And it was just a really great moment. And it just challenged me on that walk. I was just thinking through just the reality that in order to experience the divine in the daily, like I have to work and be more intentional about slowing down. About slowing down in the midst of my day, of slowing down in the midst of my week. Now, several teachings ago, we talked about building your central park, and I just talked about how Sabbath is such a huge thing, an important thing. And in fact, someone said, hey, Brad, in the notes, could you lay out what are some of your central parks? And I did that. And one of the things that I talked about in that post was, like, early mornings for me are just hugely significant. But what this challenged me was to think through about going through my day of just being more aware of what was going on around me, that to recognize that there is a divine in the daily, and it confronted me with this question. And I think it's a question that I'm asking, that I do ask myself, but I think it's also a great question for you to ask yourself is this: how much am I missing? Like, how much am I missing in the course of my day because I'm not paying attention, I'm not slowing down, I'm not becoming more aware, I'm not waking up to the reality that there is divine in the daily, and that if I just slow down a little bit more, that there are things that could be happening, there could be ways in which God is trying to speak to me that I'm just missing because I'm not aware. And I just need to get this frame of mind in the fact that God may be showing up in more places than I can imagine. And so how much am I missing in my own life, in my relationship with God? How many ways is God trying to speak to me and I'm just missing it? But not only how much am I missing in connection with God, but also how much am I missing in connection with others? That I'm just not slowing down long enough to go, man, my spouse just needs me for a few minutes. My kids, there's something going on with one of my kids, and maybe it's just a conversation. Maybe it's a moment of just discovery or learning that if I'm not slowing down, I may miss, and that could be a significant, holy, sacred moment with my kids. It could be just the coworker, that there's just this little inkling that I have. Something's off with them today. Maybe I need to encourage them. Maybe I need to speak to them. Maybe I need to just figure out, is there any way that I can serve them in any way? It might be with a friend. It might be with a family member, where maybe we get these little intuitions, but we just buzz right by them because we're moving so fast, or we're moving so fast that we're just not aware of what other people may be going through, or something that we could do that could turn out to be the highlight of the day that wasn't planned. Because oftentimes I have found it's the disruptions, it's the unexpected things that happen that end up being the most significant and memorable throughout the day. So friends, I just want to encourage you to seek the divine in the daily, to recognize that any place has the ability to burst with sacredness and holiness because God's presence is already there. And in the everyday, humdrum, mundane things of life, that those could be like repositories for the most amazing things to happen. That something significant can be just sitting there being held in that moment that we can access, not only for others, but with God as well. And so I just want to leave you with this, because one of the ways that I have tried to remind myself of the divine in the daily is that years ago I came across a song called Holy Now by a guy by the name of Peter Mayer. And different Peter Mayer than maybe most of you would think of when you hear the name Peter Mayer. But something that you can Google, YouTube, whatever, and you can pull this song up. But I just want to show just the last verse of his song, Holy Now, because it's just one of these songs that I hope you look up, I hope you listen to, because it helps me get into a frame of mind when I'm listening to the song to recognize that there is holiness everywhere and that I just need to wake up to the reality that it might be right in front of me. And so it just says this morning outside I stood and saw a little red-winged bird shining like a burning bush, singing like a scripture verse. It made me want to bow my head, and I remember when church let out, how things have changed since then. Everything is holy now. It used to be a world half there, heaven's second-rate hand-me-down, but I walk it with a reverent air, 'cause everything is holy now. So friends, may you slow down. May you wake up. May you seek the divine in the daily. That as you follow those intuitions, as you slow down and just pay attention, who knows, you might have an amazing encounter with the living God of the universe. But here's what I do know for certain, that when we live life more intentionally, the opportunities to have significant moments become more abundant than we ever imagined or believed. So I pray that is true for you this week. I pray this becomes a rhythm in your life, that this becomes a lens with which you look at the world through, and that may you find the divine in the daily. Thanks so much for stopping by. May you walk out the text well in your life.